On November 11, 1918, the guns finally fell silent along the Western Front. The Great War had ended. Britain emerged victorious. The Union Jack still flew above the largest empire in human history, a vast power stretching across nearly a quarter of the globe. In London, crowds poured into Trafalgar Square, dancing and celebrating what they believed was the triumph of democracy over Prussian militarism. To the outside world, Britain appeared as strong and dominant as ever, the unquestioned ruler of the global order. Yet inside the offices of the Treasury and the halls of Whitehall, there was no celebration. Those who examined the nation through balance sheets understood a grim truth. Victory had ruined the victor. Britain had fought the war at a financial cost that would have been unimaginable only a generation earlier. To fund the massive armies and enormous fleets required to defeat Germany, Britain exhausted vast reserves of national wealth accumulated over the previous century. Overseas assets were sold off at speed. Railways in Argentina and mines in Africa were liquidated to pay for American steel and Canadian grain. When those resources were depleted, the government turned increasingly to borrowing. By the war's end, Britain was submerged in debt. National liabilities had surged from roughly £600 million in 1914 to around £7 billion by 1918. Much of this debt was owed to the United States, and crucially, it had to be repaid in dollars. The Britain that emerged from the trenches in 1919 was economically unrecognizable compared to the nation that had gone to war 5 years earlier. Before the conflict, Britain had been the world's chief creditor. Now it was a debtor nation. Before the war, British industry dominated global commerce. During the conflict, while domestic factories focused on producing artillery shells, American firms and Japanese competitors moved in to capture Britain's export markets in textiles and machinery. The engine of the British economy began to sputter. Its core industries, coal mining, shipbuilding, and steel production in northern England, Scotland, and Wales were bloated, inefficient, and technologically outdated when compared to their new rivals. Yet the British elite, the politicians in Westminster, and the bankers of the City of London refused to accept this altered reality. They regarded the economic damage of the war not as a lasting transformation, but as a temporary disruption. They believed that once peace returned, the natural order would reassert itself, with London restored to the center of the financial world. There was an intense, almost psychological craving to return to normality, and for Britain's ruling class, normality meant one thing above all else: the gold standard. For nearly a century before the war, the gold standard had anchored the global economy. It was a system of fixed exchange rates in which every major currency was tied to a precise quantity of gold. A person could walk into the Bank of England with a £5 note and demand 5 gold sovereigns in return. Because the British pound was effectively as reliable as gold, it evolved into the world's reserve currency. International trade was conducted in sterling, and loans stretching from Tokyo to Rio were denominated in pounds. This financial supremacy formed the foundation of British imperial power. It allowed a relatively small island in the North Atlantic to wield influence far beyond its size, directing the movement of global capital. When the war broke out in 1914, Britain effectively put the gold standard on hold. It had no choice. The government needed to print vast amounts of money to pay soldiers and purchase munitions far exceeding the quantity of gold held in its vaults. The link between the paper pound and gold was severed. The outcome was inevitable inflation. During the war years, prices in Britain more than doubled. The paper pound, now floating freely on international markets, steadily lost value against the American dollar, which remained backed by gold. By 1919, the pound, once valued at $4.86, before the war had fallen as low as $3.40. To the proud men who controlled power in London, this was nothing short of a national humiliation. A weak currency in their eyes signified a weak nation. It told the world that Britain was slipping into decline. They did not see the fall in the pound as a rational economic adjustment to new circumstances, but as a moral failing. It was treated as a kind of default, a betrayal of all those who had placed their trust in British financial credibility. Across the political and financial elite, there emerged an almost unanimous agreement. Politicians of every party, senior Treasury officials, and above all the powerful governor of the Bank of England, Montagu Norman, believed that Britain's supreme priority was to return to the gold standard as quickly as possible. Yet returning to gold alone was not enough. They were determined to restore the pound at exactly the same exchange rate that had existed before the war. They wanted to reverse time. They wanted the pound to be worth $4.86 again. They wanted to behave as though the economic devastation of the previous 4 years had never occurred. This decision was fueled by pride, nostalgia, and a desperate effort to preserve London's standing in the face of New York's rising power. They convinced themselves that once the currency was fixed, everything else, trade, industry, and prosperity, would automatically fall back into place. What they failed to grasp was that the world had changed permanently. The United States was now the dominant financial power holding most of the world's gold reserves. British industry was no longer competitive enough to sustain such an expensive currency. Forcing the pound back to its pre-war value from its weakened post-war level required a dramatic economic correction. The government would need to impose a harsh deflation. Money had to be made scarce and costly. Prices and wages across the entire economy had to be pushed downward until the pound was strong enough to face the dollar on equal terms again. It was a policy of intentional economic suffocation carried out under the belief that the pain it inflicted was a necessary cure to restore the nation's financial spirit. The government prepared to bind the British economy in a straitjacket, forged from gold, convinced it was protective armor. In reality, they were preparing to sacrifice the tangible economy of factories and workers on the altar of financial prestige. The choice was made, but the cost of enforcing it would rip apart the nation's social fabric. To carry out the return to the gold standard, the British government adopted a policy of deliberately induced deflation. The method was brutally straightforward. To raise the value of the paper pound the Bank of England, under the commanding leadership of Governor Montagu, Norman had to make money scarce. Interest rates were pushed upward, choking the flow of credit to businesses. The Treasury cut government spending, pulling back from housing projects and social programs. The aim was to compress the economy until prices fell. They believed that if conditions became harsh enough, costs would decline, wages would drop, and the pound would naturally climb back to its pre-war prestige of $4.86. It amounted to a kind of economic self-starvation. The nation was attempting to force itself back into shape through deprivation. By the early 1920s, the damage was already severe. While bankers in the City of London applauded the strengthening currency, the industrial regions of the north were hemorrhaging. In the coalfields of Wales, the shipyards of Glasgow, and the cotton mills of Lancaster orders evaporated. As the pound appreciated, British goods grew steadily more expensive for foreign customers. A ton of British steel that cost a French buyer 100 francs in 1920 could cost 120 francs just 2 years later, solely because of currency movements. British industry, already burdened by outdated equipment and fierce competition, was being forced out of global markets by its own government. Joblessness began to rise. 1 million men were unemployed, then 1.5 million. The homes fit for heroes promised to returning soldiers degenerated into slums of hopelessness. Yet the financial elite viewed this suffering with a detached, almost devotional calm. Unemployment was not seen as a tragedy, but as a necessary correction, the bitter medicine required to heal the patient. In 1924, the final act of this drama began with a political appointment. Winston Churchill was named Chancellor of the Exchequer. Today he is remembered as the bulldog war leader who saved civilization in 1940. But in 1924 he was a politician searching for distinction, and he knew very little about economics. He famously admitted that when he examined the Treasury's figures, the numbers seemed to swim before his eyes. Churchill was a romantic. He adored history, revered empire, and believed deeply in the power of grand gestures. Upon arriving at the Treasury, he found himself immediately encircled by the high priests of finance, Montagu Norman of the Bank of England, and the senior civil servants. They whispered an alluring promise into his ear. It was his fate, they said, to be the man who restored Britain to gold. Returning to the gold standard, they insisted, was the only way to reclaim Britain's honor, to eradicate inflation once and for all, and to place London back at the very center of the world. Yet Winston Churchill harbored doubts. He was not a banker. He was a man shaped by the trenches, instinctively worried about what such a policy would mean for the working man, the manufacturer, and the merchant. In private memoranda, he challenged his advisors, asking why the interests of finance should outweigh those of industry. He wrote that he would rather see finance humbled and industry at ease. To settle his uncertainty, Churchill hosted a now famous dinner. He invited the leading champions of the gold standard, but also their fiercest critic, the brilliant and unconventional economist John Maynard Keynes, already renowned for predicting catastrophe from the Treaty of Versailles. Now focused on the British Treasury, Keynes delivered a devastating critique over dinner. He told Churchill that the pre-war exchange rate of $4.86 was an illusion, and that economic conditions had changed fundamentally. Judging by production costs in Britain compared with those in America, Keynes argued the pound was in reality worth about 10% less, closer to $4.40. He warned that forcing the pound back to $4.86 would artificially overvalue it by 10%, amounting to a 10% tax on British exports while granting foreign producers a 10% advantage. To remain competitive at such an inflated rate, British firms would have to cut their costs by 10%, and because labor was the largest expense in coal mines and steelworks, those cuts would inevitably fall on wages. Keynes warned Churchill directly that this policy would amount to a declaration of war on the working class, provoking wage cuts, strikes, social turmoil, and the gradual destruction of British industry, calling the policy both dangerous, needless. Churchill listened closely, deeply unsettled, but the pressure of the establishment proved overwhelming as the governor of the Bank of England, senior Treasury officials, city financiers, and Conservative Party leaders dismissed Keynes as an eccentric radical. They appealed to Churchill's pride and patriotism, warning that if Britain did not return to gold, the United States would permanently eclipse the British Empire. In the end, Churchill yielded. He chose the Council of Bankers over the caution of the economist, the past over the future, and on April 28, 1925, rose in the House of Commons to deliver his budget speech. The chamber was filled with Churchill's familiar commanding rhetoric. He proclaimed that Great Britain was returning to the gold standard at the pre-war parity of $4.86. "We are often warned that the gold standard will bind us to the United States," declared Winston Churchill. "Let me tell you what it will bind us to. It will bind us to reality." The House of Commons exploded with applause. Members waved their papers in approval. The City of London celebrated. The pound surged on the currency markets. The Times hailed the move as a triumph of statesmanship. Many saw it as the moment when the disorder of war was finally laid to rest and stability restored. Yet beyond the insulated world of Westminster, the reality Churchill spoke of struck swiftly and painfully. The golden straitjacket was fastened around the British economy and the key discarded. Almost at once, the international price of British coal leapt upward. Long-standing customers in Italy, South America, and Scandinavia studied the new prices and turned away. They shifted their purchases to cheaper coal from Germany and Poland. British mine owners panicked. Already operating on razor-thin margins, the 10% price increase caused by the overvalued currency erased what little profit remained. Every ton, hauled from the ground, now brought losses. To survive, the owners saw only one option. Costs had to be cut. They could not lower the expense of machinery or transport. The only remaining variable was labor. On June 30, 1925, barely 2 months after Churchill's announcement, the coal owners declared that the National Wage Agreement was being scrapped. Miners were told their pay would be reduced by between 13 and 25%, while the working day would be extended from 7 hours to 8. The reaction was immediate outrage. Miners were already among the poorest workers in Britain. Their jobs were dangerous, filthy, and exhausting. Now they were being asked to work longer for starvation wages, so that bankers in London could enjoy the prestige of a strong currency. The miners' union leader A. J. Cook coined a slogan that quickly became the rallying cry of the working class. Not a penny off the pay, not a minute on the day. John Maynard Keynes's warning had materialized even faster than he had anticipated. The return to gold shifted the burden of national debt directly onto the backs of those who labored the hardest. The strong pound amounted to an assault on the coal miners of Durham in order to subsidize the wine importers of Kensington. Recognizing that a major strike was looming and that the state was unprepared, the government sought to buy time. It introduced a temporary subsidy for the coal industry, keeping wages intact for 9 months. It was little more than a bandage on a gunshot wound. During that brief respite, both sides readied themselves for confrontation. The government quietly assembled an emergency supply system to keep the nation functioning without coal. The unions responded by forming the Triple Alliance of miners, transport workers, and railwaymen, pledging to stand shoulder to shoulder as the crisis gathered momentum, and Winston Churchill reportedly began to feel a growing sense of regret, believing he had been misled by financial authorities and that the gold standard was unleashing class conflict rather than stability. Yet retreat was no longer an option, as the prestige of the empire was now bound to the value of the pound itself, and to devalue would have meant admitting complete failure. So when the government subsidy expired in May 1926, the mine owners refused to withdraw wage cuts, and the money-tan miners refused to accept them. The owners responded by locking the miners out, and on May 3, 1926, Union solidarity held firm as the call to action went out. Buses ceased, running trains ground to a halt, the docks fell silent, newspaper presses stopped, turning, and the general strike began. It became the largest industrial confrontation in British history, with more than 1.7 million workers walking off their jobs, bringing the nation to a standstill, and giving many the feeling that these were the opening moments of a revolution. At the core of this turmoil, unseen but relentless, stood the gold standard, the golden chain tightening around the British economy, as the general strike of May 1926 marked the closest Britain ever came to a socialist uprising. For 9 days, the machinery of the state ground to a halt, the silence in shipyards and factories overwhelming as an organized working class fought to preserve its livelihoods against a government determined to enforce the harsh logic of the gold standard. But the authorities had prepared, carefully possessing not only reserves of coal but also an unexpected weapon in the middle class, as thousands of students, stockbrokers, and retired army officers volunteered to drive buses, unload ships, and operate trains in defense of constitutional order. Churchill, whose budget speech had ignited the crisis, took charge of the government's propaganda paper, the British Gazette, framing the strike not as a wage dispute but as a direct challenge to the state that could end only in the overthrow or triumph of parliamentary government. The message worked, and on May 12th, after only 9 days, the Trade Union Congress called off the general strike without securing a single concession for the miners, leaving them isolated for 6 punishing months as they sold furniture to buy food and watch their children grow thinner. They burned their own floorboards to keep warm, but arithmetic cannot be beaten by protest. By November 1926, hunger drove the miners back underground. They accepted longer hours and lower pay. They had been crushed by the golden straitjacket. The government and the city of London exhaled in relief. They believed victory was theirs. Order, they said, had returned. The pound was secure at $4.86. With the strike broken and wages reduced, they expected the British economy to surge. But the surge never arrived. From 1926 to 1929, while much of the world was celebrating, Britain remained on the sidelines. In the United States, these were the years of the Roaring Twenties. American industry was booming. Automobiles, radios, and skyscrapers rose at breathtaking speed. Stock prices climbed relentlessly. Even France and Belgium, which had pragmatically devalued their currencies after the war, saw recovery take hold and exports expand. Britain, by contrast, remained mired in stagnation. The underlying problem had never been solved. The pound was still too strong. British products remained overpriced on global markets. Wage reductions in the coal industry were insufficient to offset the 10% penalty imposed by the exchange rate. To keep the pound fixed at $4.86, the Bank of England was forced to maintain high interest rates. Any attempt to lower rates and stimulate borrowing would have sent gold flowing out of London toward New York, where returns were higher. As a result, Montagu Norman, the bank's governor, kept his foot firmly on the brake. It was a calamity of economic policy. At precisely the moment when British industry needed cheap credit to modernize and retool, the gold standard strangled investment. Traditional sectors, textiles, steel, and coal, continued their slow, agonizing decline. Unemployment never fell below 1 million. In some northern industrial towns, as many as 70% of men were without work. They lingered on street corners and flat caps, the excess population of an empire that had traded their livelihoods for a currency symbol. Britain's elite took comfort in the doctrine of sound money, convincing themselves that this hardship was purchasing long-term credibility. They believed they were playing a strategic long game. But in 1929, the board was overturned. In October, the Wall Street crash tore through the global economy. The Great Depression began. Britain felt the shock immediately. American lending to Europe evaporated overnight. International trade collapsed. As worldwide demand fell, Britain's already fragile export industries were devastated. Joblessness climbed sharply from 1 million to 2.5 million by 1930. Yet the final blow to the gold standard did not come from factories or docks, but from the banks. In the summer of 1931, financial panic spread across Europe like a contagion. It began in Austria with the collapse of the Credit-Anstalt. The panic soon spread to Germany, triggering a wave of bank runs there. To prevent the German economy from collapsing, outright enormous sums of capital were frozen in place. London banks had extended large loans to Germany, and overnight those assets became inaccessible. The City of London, long regarded as the banker to the world, found itself trapped in a liquidity crisis. It owed vast sums to France and the United States, yet it could not retrieve its money from Germany. Foreign investors examining the accounts reached a frightening conclusion: the Bank of England did not possess enough gold to cover its obligations. Panic leapt from Berlin to London. In July 1931, the run on the pound began. Day after day, millions of pounds worth of gold were pulled from the bank's vaults and shipped to Paris and New York. The strain proved overwhelming for Montagu Norman. Exhausted and under immense pressure, he suffered a nervous collapse and left for Canada to recover, leaving his deputies to contain the crisis. Meanwhile, the Labour government, led by Ramsay MacDonald, was cornered. To defend the pound and remain on the gold standard, orthodox economic doctrine demanded a balanced budget. Confidence had to be restored, yet tax revenues had collapsed under the weight of the Depression. The state was running a deficit. Bankers in New York and Paris delivered a blunt message. They would provide loans to support the pound only if Britain slashed government spending. Above all, they insisted on cuts to unemployment benefits. It was an extraordinarily harsh ultimatum. To preserve the currency, the government was forced to sever the thin lifeline that kept millions of families from starvation. The cabinet froze in indecision. Nearly half of the Labour ministers refused to support the cuts, arguing that they represented a betrayal of the working class. The government fell. In August 1931, a national government was assembled, a coalition of conservatives, liberals, and a handful of Labour defectors still under MacDonald's leadership. Its single mission was clear: save the gold standard. It complied fully with the bankers' demands. An emergency budget was passed that increased taxes and reduced unemployment benefits by 10%. Pay was also cut for public sector workers, including teachers, police officers, and sailors. Misery was imposed across the nation in defense of the sacred figure of $4.86. The ruling elite convinced themselves that if the pound collapsed, civilization itself would unravel. They invoked the specter of hyperinflation, pointing to Weimar Germany as a warning. The public was frightened with tales of worthless money. But the pressure had been pushed too far. The wage reductions triggered a reaction that officials in Whitehall had never anticipated. On September 15, 1931, the Atlantic Fleet of the Royal Navy lay anchored at Invergordon in Scotland. When sailors learned that their pay was to be cut, pay already scarcely sufficient to support their families, they mutinied. It was a distinctly British mutiny. There was no violence. The sailors simply refused to work, gathering on deck to sing songs. But news that the Royal Navy, the ultimate symbol of British power, had mutinied sent shockwaves through global financial markets. If the British state could not command its own navy, how could it possibly defend its currency? The steady run on the pound turned overnight into a full-scale stampede. Within 3 days, the Bank of England had lost almost all of its remaining gold and foreign exchange reserves. Millions of borrowed dollars were spent buying up pounds in a desperate effort to support the price, but it was like trying to stop a collapse with bare hands. On Saturday, September 19, 1931, the directors of the Bank of England gathered for an emergency meeting. They stared at empty vaults. They read telegrams from New York refusing further loans. The truth was unavoidable. The strategy had failed. They had starved the miners, crushed industry, cut unemployment relief, provoked a naval mutiny, and endured a decade of stagnation, all in defense of the gold standard. And still they had lost. On Sunday, September 20th, the government released a statement. Britain was suspending the gold standard. The pound would no longer be exchangeable for gold. It would be allowed to float freely and discover its value on the open market. The elite braced for catastrophe. They expected the currency to collapse entirely. They anticipated riots. They foresaw the end of London as a global financial capital. Yet when Monday arrived, something unexpected occurred. The pound did fall. It dropped from $4.86 to roughly $3.40, ironically the same level it had reached in 1919 before the disastrous experiment had begun. But the apocalypse never came. There was no surge of hyperinflation. Milk deliveries continued. Buses ran as usual. Almost immediately, the economy began to breathe again. With a cheaper pound, British goods suddenly became competitive overseas. A Rolls-Royce motor car or a bale of cotton cloth was now roughly 30% cheaper for buyers in America or France. Exports began to recover as the Bank of England no longer needed to defend a fixed gold peg. Interest rates were slashed. Cheap credit flowed into the economy. A housing boom emerged in the suburbs of London and the southeast, while new industries, aviation, automobiles, and electronics started to expand, fueled by accessible financing. The years following Britain's departure from gold were not a calamity. They marked the start of recovery. Britain emerged from the Great Depression more quickly than the United States, largely because it abandoned the golden straitjacket 2 years before Roosevelt did. The tragedy of the 1920s was finally complete. With bitter clarity, the British public realized that a decade of suffering had achieved nothing. The unemployment, the strikes, the hunger, it had all been unnecessary. The damage was self-inflicted, caused by men in London who valued the prestige of the past more than the realities of the present. The golden straitjacket stands as one of the harshest lessons in economic history. It demonstrated a fundamental truth: a currency is meant to serve the economy, not the other way around. When a nation sacrifices the well-being of its people to defend a symbol, it undermines the very power it seeks to display. Britain remained a major power for a short time longer, but the financial backbone of the empire had been broken. A decade of stagnation had eroded the industrial base just as a new threat was emerging in Germany. At that critical moment, Britain lacked the financial reserves needed to fund another great war. This marks the end of the story of how Britain crippled its own economy. It is a tale of arrogance, flawed arithmetic, and the heavy price paid by ordinary people for the vanity of their leaders. On September 21, 1931, the day after Britain abandoned the gold standard, the sun rose on a transformed world. For centuries, the City of London had stood as the unquestioned heart of global finance. Now it had blinked. By breaking the link between the pound and gold, the British Empire acknowledged that it could no longer set the rules of the world economy. This moment marked the end of Pax Britannica in financial affairs and the true beginning of the American century. Within Britain itself, however, the consequences of this decade-long experiment were only starting to solidify into lasting damage. Leaving gold saved the economy from outright collapse, but it came too late to preserve the nation's social cohesion. The 1930s in Britain would come to be remembered as the Devil's Decade, a period of deep division that revealed exactly what happens when a government values a currency symbol above its own citizens. The immediate effects of devaluation produced what became known as the Two Britons. In the South and the Midlands, where newer industries such as automobiles, aviation, and suburban housing were concentrated, cheap credit unleashed a period of growth. For the middle classes in London, living standards improved. They purchased semi-detached homes with electricity and indoor plumbing. They bought cars. They went to the cinema. For them, the crisis appeared to be over. But in the north, in the coalfields of Wales, the shipyards of Scotland, and the steel towns of the northeast, the depression never truly lifted. These were the industries that had been offered up on the altar of a strong pound during the 1920s. For 10 years, they had been deprived of investment. Their machinery was obsolete, their workers worn down, and their markets lost. Even with a cheaper currency, these sectors could no longer compete. The damage inflicted by the golden straitjacket proved irreversible. The result was a form of economic apartheid, leaving behind a bleak landscape of abandoned towns. In places such as Jarrow, a shipbuilding town in the northeast, unemployment reached 70%. These were the men who had built the battleships that secured victory in the First World War. Now they were officially deemed surplus to requirements. The government in London, still haunted by fears of inflation and debt, refused to spend money to assist them. It clung to rigid economic orthodoxy, insisting that the market would eventually correct itself. But the market did not correct itself. It abandoned them. In October 1936, this despair erupted into one of the most powerful symbols in modern British history, the Jarrow Crusade. 200 men from Jarrow, dressed in their best Sunday coats, set out on foot from the northeast of England on a 300-mile march to London. They were not marching to riot. They were not marching to overthrow the state. Their demand was far simpler. They marched to ask for the right to work. Carrying a petition signed by their entire town, they appealed to the government to build a steelworks so they could earn enough to feed their families. They pressed on through rain and wind, sleeping in church halls and barns along the way. They were the living ghosts of the gold standard, moving slowly through the countryside. When they finally reached London, they expected to be heard. They believed the government would acknowledge their suffering. Instead, the Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin refused to meet them, fearing that doing so would create a dangerous precedent. He gave them £1 each for their train fare home and dismissed them. The Jarrow Crusade failed to deliver jobs, but it succeeded in etching the image of abandonment into the national conscience. It revealed that the economic scars of the 1920s had produced a class of people who were, in effect, non-citizens, discarded by the financial calculations of the City of London. That resentment fed the growth of political extremism. As in Germany, where economic collapse had opened the door to Hitler, the suffering of Britain's industrial regions became fertile ground for radical movements. Oswald Mosley, a charismatic aristocrat and former Labour minister, looked at the paralysis of Parliament and concluded that democracy itself had failed. He went on to establish the British Union of Fascists. Wearing black shirts and staging rallies at Earl's Court, Mosley told unemployed men that Britain could only be saved by crushing the bankers and politicians who had betrayed them. He never achieved the power Hitler did, largely because Britain's middle class remained relatively secure, buoyed by the housing boom. Still, the sight of thousands of Britons marching in black uniforms testified to the profound instability created by years of economic mismanagement. As British society fractured internally, the empire itself began to retreat. Having lost the financial strength needed to impose a global free trade system, Britain pulled back behind protective barriers. In 1932, at the Ottawa Conference, Britain abandoned the free trade doctrine it had championed for a century. In its place, it introduced imperial preference. Tariffs were raised against American and German goods, while trade within the empire with Canada, Australia, and India was favored. It was a defensive posture. The empire, once a driving force of global commerce, turned inward into a closed block, seeking shelter rather than expansion. This shift was an admission that Britain could no longer compete freely in the open world market. The catastrophe of the gold standard had narrowed the empire's horizons. Intellectually, the disaster of the 1920s reshaped how the world understood money forever. It was the ultimate vindication of John Maynard Keynes. For more than a decade, Keynes had been a lone voice, warning that the gold standard was a barbaric relic of the past. He had cautioned Winston Churchill in 1925. He had warned successive governments again in 1931. In the end, every one of his predictions proved correct. The suffering endured by British workers confirmed Keynes's central argument: economies do not automatically heal themselves. Keynes insisted that when an economy is trapped in depression, the state must intervene. It must spend. It must borrow. And above all, it must place employment ahead of the value of the currency. His book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, published in 1936, functioned as a post-mortem on Britain's disastrous economic policies of the 1920s. The book transformed economics. It permanently discredited the gold standard. The post-war international system, the framework that still shapes the modern world, was built on Keynesian principles explicitly designed to prevent the kind of rigid dogma that had devastated Britain's coal miners. Yet, as history so often shows, these lessons were learned too late. By the late 1930s, war clouds were once again gathering over Europe. When Britain confronted Nazi Germany in 1939, it did so from a position of weakness. Its industrial base was smaller and less efficient than Germany's. Its shipyards were struggling, and its treasury was no longer overflowing with gold as it had been in 1914. To fight Hitler, Britain was forced to borrow once again. This time, however, it could not dictate the terms. It had to rely on the United States. The Americans, mindful of the financial turmoil of the interwar period, drove a hard bargain. They demanded payment on a cash-and-carry basis, followed by the Lend-Lease agreement. In return for destroyers and oil, Britain handed over its gold reserves, sold off its remaining American assets, and even leased strategic naval bases to the U.S. Navy. By the end of the Second World War in 1945, the transfer of wealth was complete. The British Empire was not merely bankrupt, it had been financially dismantled. The gold that Montagu, Norman, and Churchill had struggled so desperately to defend during the 1920s was gone, shipped to Fort Knox to pay for the weapons that liberated Europe. The saga of the Golden Straitjacket stands as a tragedy born of good intentions. The men who made these choices, Churchill, Norman, and senior Treasury officials, were not villains. They were patriots who believed they were acting to restore national greatness. But they committed the fundamental error of economics. They became enamored with a symbol. They mistook the map for the territory. They believed a nation's strength lay in the value of its currency rather than in the productivity of its people. They sacrificed the real economy to preserve the financial one. In doing so, they lost both. In the end, the British pound was only a promise, and in the 1920s, the British government broke its promise to its own citizens in order to keep a promise to a piece of yellow metal. It stands as a stark warning to every modern government. An economy is meant to serve its society, not to balance a ledger for its own sake. When that balance is ignored, empires collapse. I'm John, and this is the Cinematic History Tales channel. Subscribe to stay ahead of the curve, because when history is written, you'll want to be among those who saw it coming.